All right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. To open up the session and to kick us off, I'm going to invite the SBI chair to make a few opening remarks. So Charlotte, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, good morning and good day and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Dear colleagues, I would like to welcome you all to this briefing session on agenda item 3 of the third meeting of the Subsidiary Body of Implementation. This agenda item is analysis of progress towards the implementation of a strategic plan for biodiversity on the basis of a strategic plan for biodiversity on the information contained in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans and also in the 6 national reports. Under this agenda item, the subsidiary body will have before it an analysis of progress prepared by the Secretariat, and you can find it in document CBD/SBI/3/2. Additional documents have been prepared describing the status of implementation and providing an analysis of revised national biodiversity strategy and action plans. The additional documents also provide an analysis of a contribution of national targets established by parties, progress towards the achievement of biodiversity targets, progress in gender mainstreaming, and the implementation of the 2015 to 2020 Gender Plan of Action, as well as the request information relating to the implementation of Article 8A and related provisions. The purpose of this session is to introduce the agenda items and the different documents to facilitate preparations for the SBI discussions and also highlight links to associated agenda items. It is not the intention to negotiate in this session, but the Secretariat will of course answer to questions you may have and on documents and also on procedural issues. So I will now hand over to Kieran Money and his colleagues from Secretariat to take us through the presentation. I hope you will have a good webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and welcome to everyone. So as Charlotte said, the presentation today is going to focus on agenda item 3 from the third meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation. So just before we get started, just wanted to make a few sort of housekeeping announcements. So this session is being recorded and we're going to make it available online through the CBD webpage after the session. So if you miss anything or if any of your colleagues were unable to join, they'll be able to catch up in that way. In order to ask questions, there's a question box at the bottom right of your field. So just enter your questions there and we'll see them. We'll address them all probably as a group at the end, but feel free to ask questions at any time. All the documentation that we're referring to today is accessible from the link shown below on your screen. None of the information that we're going to be showing today is new. It's just the conclusions or the information that's presented in the pre-session documents for SBI. So it's really just an opportunity to further explore that, but none of it is new information, and all the figures you'll see are actually in those documents. So just to recap, the mandate for this agenda item and really for all the documentation that has been prepared has come primarily from these 3 decisions. So what these 3 decisions have in common is they all relate to reviewing implementation of the convention or the strategic plan or the gender plan of action. So these are all mandates that refer to the main function or one of the main functions of the COP, which is to keep the implementation of the convention under review. That said, this is also because the focus is on review. The documentation is sort of a backwards looking agenda item. So it's looking at what's happened over the last 10 years. It also because of that, links quite strongly to agenda items 5 and 9. So agenda item 5 is on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and agenda item 9 is on mechanisms for reporting, assessment, and review. And it's under these agenda items where we expect that much of the more forward-looking discussions would happen. So agenda item 3 really should help to inform agenda item 5 and 9. So the documents that have been prepared, there's 5 of them. There's one pre-session document, which contains a very short draft recommendation, which is essentially just recalling the results of the conclusion, and then 4 addendums. And these addendums look at national biodiversity strategies and action plans, national targets, the gender plan of action, and traditional knowledge. And each one of these issues is addressed in its own separate section in the main pre-session document. So jumping in now to the substance of the analysis. So the first part of the document looks at national biodiversity strategies and action plans and the progress that has been made in those. So I think one thing that's important to recognize is that currently the majority of countries have gone through the process of establishing an NBSAP, and that represents a significant investment of time and resources. So that's really something quite positive. On the flip side, however, we also know that in IT Target 17, there was a requirement or a request of parties to revise or update their NBSAP by 2015. Now, unfortunately, only about a third of parties actually were able to meet that deadline. However, since that time, we now have about 85% of parties that have an NBSAP that's been developed or updated to bring it in line with the IG biodiversity target, with the strategic plan and the IG biodiversity targets. One of the interesting observations from these newer NBSAPs is that actually a lot of cross-sectoral coordination appears to be occurring. So if you look in the chart or the graph that's on the right, it shows the involvement of different sectors or ministries in the development of NBSAPs. And what we see quite positively is that there's been lots of engagement, for example, from the agriculture sector, the fishery sector, development, tourism, etc. So we do see that sort of some of the mainstreaming potential of NBSAPs is being fulfilled. However, obviously, when you look at that list and you look at the numbers, there's clearly more work that needs to be done to really get a really sort of full and rich integration of these different processes. Also, what's interesting is that most of the involvement of these other sectors and ministries appears to be at the level of consultation and not so much on the implementation side. So turning into a bit more detail to the assessment itself, as you're probably aware in decision 9.8, there's actually a long list of sort of guidance on what should be in the NBSAPs. And the analysis that we've done in this document follows that, looks at that guidance and sees how closely or not each NBSAP aligns to it. And that guidance addresses various things, including just sort of basic information on what should be in an NBSAP, how the revision process should be undertaken, what would be the main elements of the NBSAP, and how mainstreaming should go. So when we turn to that, when we start looking at the different, or dissecting the different bits of that guidance, we see in some cases we see a lot of progress, but also a number of limitations or issues that need to be considered. So one of the first things that we look at in the document is the extent to which NBSAPs have been adopted as policy instruments. And while we see a lot of promising progress, there's still, I think, a bit more work that needs to be done in that respect. So for example, only about 69 countries have adopted their NBSAPs as whole of government policies. What that means is that the NBSAP, while a really important tool and a lot of effort has gone into developing them, they're not necessarily being applied outside of the biodiversity sector, if you will. Then turning again to some of the other elements, so when we look at resource mobilization strategies, costing plans for the implementation of NBSAPs for issues around the development of communication and public awareness strategies for the NBSAP and capacity development, what we see is that relatively few NBSAPs actually address these. So that's a bit of a problem because these are issues that would really help to enable the further implementation of the NBSAP. So there's kind of a bit of perhaps a lost opportunity in this respect to really make the NBSAP a fully functional and easy to implement tool. Similarly, when we look at issues to mainstreaming, so as I mentioned before, we've seen a lot of progress in terms of involving different sectors and ministries and organizations in the development of NBSAPs, but there also appear to be some missed opportunities in terms of further mainstreaming. So, for example, relatively few NBSAPs are linked to sustainable development plans. Similarly, few of them are linked to national development plans. Not a lot refer to evaluation studies, and similarly to links to poverty eradication. So these are perhaps opportunities that to further mainstream the NBSAP process that are not being fully realized. So that's sort of the first part of the document or the analysis that's been prepared. The second part of the analysis looks into a bit more detail on the different national targets that countries have set. So quite positively, the majority of NBSAPs actually contain national targets or similar types of commitments to further operationalize the strategic plan at a national level. So that's really positive. So in our assessment, we looked at 167 NBSAPs, and what we did was we looked at the targets or commitments that were contained in those NBSAPs, and then matched them to the Aichi target and did an assessment of how closely or not they were aligned to the goals and aspirations set out in the Aichi targets. So there's more on the methodology that we used in the addendum, including sort of all the caveats that go with it. And what we see is that the Aichi targets that are most closely addressed through national targets are Aichi targets 1, 19, 16, 17, 19, and 20. So that's really quite positive, but then at the same time, we note that a number of Aichi targets are not picked up as much in the NBSAPs. So these are targets 3, 6, 10, and 14. So on the graph or on the table, which you see in front of you, closer alignment is shown by these really dark colors. So if, for example, for a given Aichi target, all of the national targets were equally commensurate with the Aichi targets, the whole bar would be a dark black or gray. So when we look across all the Aichi targets, what we see is that on a whole, it's just about a fifth of the national targets which are either similar to the scope of the Aichi target or which exceed it. So the next part of the assessment is based on information largely drawn from the national reports. So we looked at 156 national reports that had been submitted and looked at what they said about progress towards national targets. So if you'll recall, the template for the national reports requested parties to rate their level of progress towards each of their national targets using a 5-point scale. National targets were then linked to the Aichi targets, so we compiled all that information and presented it here. So on the whole, what we see is about 1/3 of national targets are on track to be met, and that's illustrated in this table by this green color and the blue, which shows the number of parties that are expected to exceed their national targets. And about half of parties have made progress towards their national targets, but not at a sufficient rate, and that's shown in this table by this yellow bar. So on the whole, we're seeing progress, but given sort of the disproportionate amount of yellow and red, not at a rate that would allow or would give us confidence that we were on track to reach the Aichi targets. This is similar to the conclusions from the assessment that was done for COP14, and it's also similar to the main conclusions from IPBES. We also then looked at to the extent to which national targets which were similar to the Aichi targets were on track to be met, and that amounted to only about 10%. So only about 10% of the national targets which were similar to the Aichi targets, only 10% of those are on track to be met. So I know that's a huge amount of information to try and digest in this session, but I guess to sort of leave you with three sort of takeaway points and the three high-level messages from all of that. So what we see is that there's obviously been a lot of effort made to translate the Aichi biodiversity targets into national commitments and to national actions. So that's quite clear from the national reports. However, when we look at all the information in aggregate, what we see is that there are gaps in relation to the level of ambition of the national targets. So when we look across all the national targets that have been set, they don't quite add up to the global aspirations set out in the Aichi targets. And similarly, the efforts to reach these national targets, also there appears to be a gap. So those are, I think, two of the most important issues that come up out of this assessment and could help inform discussions moving forward. Lastly, I just want to flag that this assessment had a number of challenges and limitations stemming from the fact that countries have applied the guidance for the national reports and for the NBSAPs in slightly different ways. So at times it's quite challenging to actually compare and to aggregate up all these different types of information. So this assessment does have a number of caveats which are further addressed in the documentation for the meeting. So I'll leave that for you to explore at your own time. I'm raising it now because these are issues that parties may wish to consider in particularly their discussions under Agenda Item 9 under review mechanisms. So that's the first sort of half of the documentation or so. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Tanya, who's going to speak a bit about the findings from the review of the Gender Plan of Action. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kieran, and hello everyone. I hope you're having a good day. As mentioned earlier, a review was requested in the decision at the last COP, and this was to look at identifying gaps, best practices, and lessons learned of the current Gender Plan of Action. So a review was undertaken at the end of last year and early this year to prepare the SBI document, and this involved looking at 6 national reports that had been received by early November and looking at the gender references and information within those reports, as well as information from 2 global surveys. One was put out for government representatives, and one was for other representatives of other relevant organizations. So the review is based on the findings from those 2 surveys, as well as the review of the national reports. And it looks at sort of 5 different areas. The first is the effectiveness of the plan as a guiding framework. It looks at the effectiveness of actions by parties, as well as actions by the Secretariat. Looks as well at best practices, lessons learned, and gaps, and considerations and some conclusions for the post-2020 period. So I'm going to touch on each of these areas in the next few slides. So I'll just go to the next slide now. So the plan is a guiding framework. One of the findings that came out of the review was that the current plan was seen to be seemed to function as a policy or advocacy tool to support or provide a mandate for integrating gender into biodiversity efforts. It also served to promote gender equality and women's empowerment in the context of biodiversity at a global level. It enhanced an awareness of linkages between gender and biodiversity, as well as functioned as some sort of blueprint to support collaborative efforts between parties and other partners, and to give a bit of a framework for parties to undertake specific actions on addressing gender in the context of biodiversity. It was also found that there was a bit of a limited contribution of the plan to national level implementation. So just go on to the next slide. So looking at actions by parties, and this is based largely on the review of the 6 national reports. Based on the review of the reports that we had received by November, we saw that there is an increase in reporting on gender and women. And I think this is also in part due to an initiative by UNDP, who was supporting a number of countries to prepare their 6 national reports and put an emphasis on the reports being gender responsive. So we did find in those reports that there was quite, and some of those reports especially, quite an extensive reflection of gender and women's issues, more than we have seen in previous reports in the past. So I think that was a very positive initiative and allowed us to draw some more useful information from the reporting. Some of the themes that were reflected in these reports included things such as women's participation in biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, as well as the value of women's leadership in these areas. They looked at provision of capacity building and training, particularly involving women or focused on women, and the integration of gender into biodiversity policies, as well as reflecting different areas of progress.
Sorry, Tanya, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. It appears that people can't see the slides, so perhaps you want to turn off your camera, and then I think that will allow the slides to be seen. Sorry about that.
Okay, I hope this improves things now. I'll just keep going, and I also hope that the recording at least will show the slides. For those of you that just missed, I think it was only 2 slides so far. Just to continue with what I was mentioning in terms of actions by parties, the reports in many cases provided some short and some informative case examples of initiatives that are being undertaken in different countries that give us some more robust and rich information of what is happening in terms of addressing gender. And they also provide, to some extent, sex disaggregated data that has been collected in different areas. In respect to actions by the Secretariat, these include building and communicating rationale for a gender responsive approach. This includes in respect to looking at the gender linkages between with the IG targets, among other things. Actions have been undertaken at national, regional, and global levels. So this includes some support that has been provided to some countries to develop gender responsive MBSAPs, as well as regional capacity building efforts and the preparation of materials that can be used at a global level to support the integration of gender into biodiversity programming and policy. Also on the level of partnerships, the Secretariat has initiated and established some partnerships with key UN agencies, including through the GEF Gender Partnership and with UN Women, as well as others, and has also supported the engagement of parties and civil society through such things as supporting the Friends of Gender Equality Group and the CBD Women's Caucus. So I'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of best practices, lessons learned, and gaps, so I was just going to give a quick review here. Some of the best practices that came out in included things such as looking at or undertaking analyses and reviews of biodiversity policies to better address or integrate gender better into these policies. So based on the review, revisiting the policies. At the institutional level, this included putting in place directives and funding requirements to ensure that gender could be integrated both at the level of process and the staffing of the organization, as well as the work being done by the institution. And other initiatives included those that addressed awareness raising, capacity building, and network or information sharing, all in the same initiative. So there's more detail obviously in the report, but that just gives you some idea of the types of things that were identified as best practices. In terms of lessons learned, this includes highlighting that there has been some value in having a gender plan of action for the convention. Also that there is a need for clear, actionable, and measurable objectives, such as within the strategic plan and for consideration within the post-2020 framework itself, that objectives related to gender need to be well understood, and that there's a need for concerted action and investment over the long term, and a need to build on project results to strengthen action at larger scales. In respect to gaps, these refer to things that are important for enabling implementation at the national level, and are things that have come out of other reviews on these topics. So it includes things like the need for capacity development, the need for consistent collection and analysis of sex disaggregated data, as well as adequate financing targeted for gender mainstreaming and consistent reporting. So with that, I'll move on to the last slide. So lastly, and this was largely drawn from the survey, we looked at considerations for the post-2020 period and how we can aim to better reflect and address gender in this coming decade. So one of the proposals that was put forward was that there is a need or a value in having a new gender plan of action to implement or to serve to implement the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and that such a plan should be developed in a participatory and consultative manner, and that there is also, again, a need to mainstream gender in MBSAPs, as well as integrate it into the post-2020 review process and in reporting at the national level. So I just also want to mention this report is available, the summary of the review is available online, but some ongoing activities that are underway right now include a review of best practices. So this builds on the best practices that were identified in the review, but taking a broader look to look at even more recent examples of where actions have been undertaken in different countries and different regions around the world that can be considered innovative, transformative, and happening at a larger scale. So we have already put out a request for input on this, and we thank all of you who have provided that input and now compiling this into a publication that will be available this fall. And furthermore, there was a webinar just 2 weeks ago that was launching and introducing a draft outline of a new gender plan of action that has been prepared. And this is intended to respond to what has come out of the review, that we have a request for a new gender plan of action, and so to have something in place, if possible, for the post-2020, in line with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The deadline for initial comments or for comments on this draft outline is this Monday, the 31st of August. So I'd really encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to provide your comments and send in your submission by Monday this week. So the draft outline and the review template are available at the link shown here. So with that, I will hand things back to Kieran, and thank you very much.
So thank you, Tanya. So I just wanted to remind everybody that at any point, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We already have a few, so we'll address those at the end, but please feel free to put your questions in there at any time. So now we're going to move over to John, who's going to talk a bit about the last part of the document, which has to deal with traditional knowledge and progress towards Aichi Target 18. So John, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Mohawk Territory in Canada. I'll turn my camera off so there's no problem with our slides. Today I'd like to give you an overview of the progress report on our work with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Of course, a progress report was developed for the 11th meeting of the Working Group on HA last November, and then it was updated with 156 reports being examined for the third meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation. Just to remind people, of course, the working group and SBI meet every 2 years, and the current progress report was considered by the working group, will be considered by SBI 3, and then, of course, any draft recommendations will go to COP15. And I'm not going to read all of this to you. This will be made available to you, so I just want to touch on the parts in red. So we measure progress also, of course, through the reports from the parties, which is submitted approximately every 4 years. The Secretariat and also other partners like UNDP analyze the development and implementation of NBSAP's National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. And also we have input from Indigenous peoples and local communities through their initiative referred to as community-based monitoring and information systems, which have been recognized by the governing body of the convention. Thank you. Next slide. So just to remind you, during the past decade, the following proxy indicators were accepted for traditional knowledge. And they are linguistic diversity and numbers of speakers of Indigenous languages. And you may know that UNESCO is doing work on an atlas and a decade of action on languages starting next year. The other indicator is land use change and land tenure on traditional territories. Also the practice of traditional occupations, and trends, and the last one, of course, is the trends to which traditional knowledge and practices are respected through their full integration and safeguards, and the full and effective participation of Indigenous and local communities in the work of the convention. And participation is measured, of course, by the Secretariat, analysing the amount of people who come to meetings, interventions made, the operations of the voluntary fund. So those were the 4 indicators that were agreed upon. Next slide, thanks. So progress. In comparison, of course, COP14 asked encourage parties to increase their efforts for the protection and respect of traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use. When we looked at the 5th national reports compared to the 6th national reports, there is a significant increase in information. In fact, I'll go straight down to the bottom. In fact, between the 5th and the 6th national reports, there was a 3-fold increase in reporting on the collective and local actions of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including traditional knowledge, customary sustainable use, traditional agriculture, through the national reports. So this was a real bright spot for the 6th national report. Next slide. So some progress has been made in implementing HA, but I would say good progress has been made in raising awareness. And that's probably the first step before we get real traction. Of course, the increased awareness has not been translated into action, and not all aspects of Target 18, of course, have been met by the end of the decade. Okay, next slide. Now, the actions reported in the national reports are very interesting. There's reports of the capacity building workshops and trainings, and particularly where Indigenous peoples and local communities and governments come together to build bridges and work together. There's also reports of co-management of protected areas, and on the spectrum of protected areas, there's also recognition of Indigenous and local community conservation areas, and also Indigenous protected areas. Also, we have more examples of Indigenous peoples and local communities in charge of local resource management and conservation. Also, there is work going on documenting and recording and developing inventories on traditional knowledge by Indigenous peoples and local communities themselves. So there's some interesting actions reported. Next slide. So, and to take you through these quickly, there's action plans for the protection and promotion of traditional medicines in different countries, commercialization of edible wild produce, to assist local economies, increased mechanisms for consultations with Indigenous peoples and local communities. We're seeing the incorporation of traditional knowledge in decision-making processes, the development of policies, programs and projects on traditional knowledge, and very important, the elaboration of national legislation and political frameworks for the Nagoya Protocol, which of course addresses genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. So, and we also have guidelines for establishing community protocols, and we're seeing an increased development of community protocols by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So, and next slide. So we have support for community-based efforts to revive and restore agroecology, which are traditional farming practices. And this is very interesting in terms of sustainable local production and the SDGs. We also have Indigenous peoples recording and documenting their traditional knowledge to protect it. And also, of course, I think I've just mentioned this, we have legal frameworks for the Nagoya Protocol that provide that access to genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge is based on prior and informed consent, and the use on mutually agreed terms guaranteeing an equitable sharing of benefits. So the Nagoya Protocol, of course, is very significant to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide, thank you. So an analysis, there's ample evidence that capacity building programs that focus on traditional knowledge that bring Indigenous and local communities and parties together make a difference. However, only 16 parties out of 196 parties or 156 reports reviewed mentioned the engagement of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan processes. So an additional challenge is that very few parties have addressed all the elements of the global target, Target 18, in their national target. So furthermore, parties have not adopted or made use of national indicators commensurate with the 4 indicators adopted for traditional knowledge in Decision 1328. So there's no framework in place at a national level to agree on indicators and measure progress on traditional knowledge. Next slide, please. So some conclusions as we wrap up. We have a threefold increase between the 5th and 6th reports in mentioning Indigenous peoples and local communities. It's often on a project level rather than talking about individual projects, rather than about a large change or policy at a programmatic level. So only 16 parties of the 150 reports we looked at mentioned engaging Indigenous peoples and local communities in the NBSAPS process. So obviously much more work needs to be done to make the NBSAPS a truly participatory process, and also to capture the very useful collective and local actions that are going on the ground that are not being captured in national reporting. Or even in the plans for conservation and sustainable use. So I think next slide is the last. So no party adopted a national target that covered all the elements of Global Target 18, nor did they adopt indicators commensurate with the global indicators agreed for traditional knowledge, making it difficult to measure. And there we have the indicators just to remind you. And I think that probably brings us to the conclusion. So certainly some improvements in raising awareness, but we still need this translated into action. And these are good lessons, of course, as we think about the negotiations for the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much, my colleagues and friends. I'll stop.
So thank you very much, John. So that concludes sort of the formal presentation aspect of the session today. So now we'll turn to the questions. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the question field. So I'll just jump in and start answering some of the questions that are there. So there's a question about whether we've done any sort of comparative analysis on progress towards the Aichi targets based on what was reported sort of at the halfway mark. So in 2015, what's being reported now. So we've tried to do that. It's a bit challenging because the formats for the 5th national report and the 6th national report were different. So the information's not easily comparable. So we haven't really done that in an in-depth or detailed way. However, when we do look sort of at the big conclusions that from the assessment we did in 2015 and the assessment we're doing now, and that we're also doing through the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, the big overall picture hasn't changed, which is that there is progress towards the majority of targets, but as a whole, that progress is not sufficient or would not be sufficient to say that the Aichi targets have been met. And this is a similar conclusion to what was in the 4th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and it's also similar to what got picked up in the IPBES Global Assessment. Unfortunately, we don't really have enough information or the right type of information to really do an in-depth comparison between the two periods based on the information that's in the national report. We can kind of get at that through other things like indicators, however, and we do some of that in the upcoming 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. There's another question as to whether when we talk about adopting NBSAPs as a whole of government document, if that would also include cities, states, and provinces. And in that case, I think it really sort of depends on what the national circumstances are in a country. What we mean by whole of government or whole of, by whole of government policy is that it's a policy that is not just for the environment sector or the ministry that deals with biodiversity, but rather has implications for all the other ministries and processes that occur at a national level. So to the extent that a country would have policies and legislation in place that would affect cities, states, and provinces, then presumably it would apply, but it's kind of hard to say, to make a blanket statement for all countries. So there was a request to make the URL available for the documentation. So it's here on this screen. There's also a question as to when the materials will be translated into UN languages. So everything we've presented in this session is based on documentation that's prepared for SBI, and all of that has already been translated, and it's available. And it's available from the SBI page, so you can see all the material we've presented here translated into the official languages. So then the next question is, what is the biggest challenge parties have pointed at for limited progress in meeting Aichi targets? It's important to know what has gone, and then in quotation marks, wrong in the past, not to make the same mistakes. So it's kind of hard to generalize, and what we've done in the AD1 document is actually broken it down target by target. So, or sorry, not in AD1, in AD2. So in that document, we have a section that looks at each Aichi target individually and lists the examples that countries have said they've taken, and also lists some of the challenges. And the challenges really vary by target. So I think, generally, if I had to generalize, I would say that, for some countries, the lack of resources is clearly an issue. Another challenge that frequently comes up is the challenge of sort of scaling up good actions. So what we see in the national reports is that there's a lot of really interesting projects happening, but a lot of them are at sort of don't get past the project level. So how do you take a really good innovative approach and sort of scale that up? That's also been a challenge for a number of countries. Another challenge that frequently comes up is the need to work with other sectors that, or other issues that perhaps fall outside the control of environment ministries. So, the need to work with agricultural sectors and fishery sectors and development and planning in some countries, that's been quite a challenge. So I would say those are probably some of the bigger overarching challenges that have been identified. And then there's another question, John. I'm gonna send this question to you, and the question is, how were the Target 18 indicators developed?
Thanks, Karen. The Target 18 indicators were developed at different stages and were the ones that were recommended by Indigenous peoples and local communities. So I can't give you exact dates. Of course, the first one that was adopted was languages, and then that followed land tenure, occupations, and participation. With land tenure and changing land use, we also now have the International Land Coalition, which is established by IFAD in Rome, that is a potential source of collecting information. So this is in the, it could be operationalized quite easily. And now, of course, with languages, we have the UNESCO Atlas for Indigenous Languages and the Decade of Action on Indigenous Languages. So UNESCO from next year will also be able to start on that indicator. Unfortunately, the ILO has the mandate for collecting information about traditional occupations, but doesn't have the resources to do so. So we haven't had any traction on that. And the participation, of course, we can also do ourselves through analysing the national reports in the NBSAPs. So I'll stop there. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, John. So another question that just came in is, will there be further analysis of the reports that hadn't been handed in by the cutoff date? So I think that will largely depend on the number of additional reports that we receive. So because we've analyzed 156 national reports, unless we get, if we just get 1 or 2 reports, we probably wouldn't do a full update just because the overall conclusions wouldn't change. However, if we get several, that's something we could explore. Obviously, it would also depend on sort of the timing for meetings and the time that is available. So we'll sort of have to see how that evolves. But it is something that we could do. So we could issue after SBI, for example, we could issue a further update of this analysis if there's sufficient information to do so. Then there was also a question, and this one I'll give to Tanya. Actually, it's a 2-part question. So the first part is, how many countries have prepared a gender plan of action? And is there any indication as to what the % of progress has been in the gender plan of action? So Tanya, those are 2 questions for you.
Oh, thanks, Karen, and thanks for the question. Countries that have prepared a gender plan of action, I would have to get back to you on that. I would say in the reports, very few in general. I do know of at least 1 country that is preparing a plan now, but to my knowledge, there are very few countries that have taken the step to actually prepare a plan that is focused on gender and biodiversity. In terms of % of progress in implementation of the gender plan of action, I think that was the question. That's very difficult to measure. I think I touched on it in the review document, but the way the plan was formulated, it doesn't necessarily lend itself well to monitoring progress at a very specific level. So this is something that I mentioned briefly in the presentation around the need for clear, measurable, and actionable objectives for the post-2020 period. So I think this is something that is important to consider for a new gender plan of action, as well as for the post-2020 framework itself. that any objectives put forward need to be well understood, and they also need to be clearly measurable, because if not, it leaves us in a position where we can provide more potentially qualitative information, but cannot necessarily give a more precise update or analysis of actual progress. So I think that's
great.
That's all I can say right now. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Tanya. So I'm just looking through the questions, and I don't see any more. So I think we've answered all of them. So unless there are further questions, oh, Simon. So then there's a comment here. I think it's a comment rather than a question, but I'll give an opportunity to Tanya to respond if she thinks it's needed. So to strengthen the global plan of action, there also needs to be indicators and have synergies with the monitoring framework that is being developed for the global biodiversity framework. So that, I think that's more of a comment as opposed to a question. But I'm not sure if Tanya, you want to say anything in response to that.
Sure. Yeah, just to say that is a valid point, and I think it's something we need to really consider for a new gender plan of action, and also in looking at the monitoring framework for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, where can we ensure that gender is addressed in the indicators that are put forward? Because again, if we don't have those markers in place, it makes it much more difficult to measure and make any more precise analysis on that basis.
Right. So then I guess this is another more of another question actually on gender, Tanya. Is it really necessary to develop national gender plans of action? Gender has been mainstreamed into NBSAPs, at least in some countries. I think this would be better because gender actions are biodiversity related. So, I mean, that's a question. It's also a bit of a comment. So I'm not sure, Tanya, if you want to just, we can just leave that out there, or if it's something that you want to address.
I'll just respond briefly, just to say that I think it's very much up to individual countries to determine what is needed. And I think in some cases it may be useful to have a plan that builds on the MBSAP that can provide a more specific set of actions and or set of activities and time frame. It really depends how a plan is structured even at that level, but it can provide a basis for more targeted action. But again, if activities are clearly identified and resourced in MBSAPs, that may not be necessary for all countries. So I think it's something that needs to be considered at the national level in terms of country context. Thanks.
Great. So still just checking the questions. So John, I think this is a question for you, and I'll read it. And have you disaggregated local community issues from Indigenous people issues, since local community involvement is generally very poor? And then have you analyzed the development of methodologies to prepare NBSAPs, since processes and appropriate methodologies are fundamental for effective NBSAP? So actually, I think the first question is to you, and I can take the second one. So the first question is, have you disaggregated local community issues from Indigenous people's issues?
Thanks, Kieran, and this is also tied in with gender. One of the big weaknesses we have is lack of disaggregated data according to sex and ethnicity. And until we have, until parties develop data that's broken down on sex and ethnicity, it's very hard. Also, under the convention, we don't divide up Indigenous peoples and local communities. There is some local community representatives that regularly work with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. It also, using local communities, allows us to ensure that Indigenous peoples that perhaps are not recognised are also allowed to come to the table. So yes, we don't break up data based on Indigenous versus local, but the problem with data is much bigger than that, and that is countries largely do not desegregate data based on sex and ethnicity, and that's also a problem, of course, with gender. Thank you.
So the second question in that two-part question was about whether we've looked at or analyzed the development of methodologies to prepare NBSAPs. So the Conference of the Parties has actually in several decisions set out pretty detailed guidance on what should go into the process for developing an NBSAP. So what we've done in our assessment is looked at the extent to which those NBSAPs follow or match up with that guidance that's been developed by the COP. At various times we've had capacity building workshops and prepared sort of other more informal documentation where we've explored and sort of showcased different approaches that countries have used in developing their NBSAP. So that's kind of what we've done on that issue. So our focus has really been on looking at the extent to which parties are following the guidance, which has been set out in various COP decisions. So John, I guess I have another question for you. What are the expectations after the definition of What are the expectations after the definition of linguistic diversity and IPAs and ICCAs?
Sorry, Karen, can you repeat the last?
Yeah, sorry. What are the expectations after the definition of linguistic diversity and IPAs and Indigenous ICCAs, Indigenous Conserved Community Areas?
If I understood the question, it's about the definitions of ICCAs and IPAs. There's lots of acronyms, of course, and in the convention, the official term, if I get the acronym right, is other effective conservation areas under other effective conservation measures, and I don't even know what the acronym for that is. But of course, it means different things in different parts of the world. Indigenous protected areas in Australia means something very different to what it does in other countries, where Indigenous peoples are managing 9% of the 17% of the national target for protected areas. Yeah, so maybe that in part at least answers the question. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, John. So I'm just looking at the clock and we're getting a bit short on time. So I'm gonna perhaps just do a few more questions, and then we'll bring the session to a close, I think. So I think the other questions that I see, so Tanya, this is a question for you. Once the outline for the Gender Plan of Action is completed, would parties and civil society be provided with an additional opportunity to review and provide feedback before the Gender Plan of Action is presented at SBI 3?
Thanks, Karen. Sorry, could you just repeat the last part of the question? I didn't catch that.
Right. So I guess I mean, just to summarize, is there going to be an opportunity to provide further input on the development of the Gender Plan of Action before SBI 3? Or is the current sort of peer review consultation process the last point before SBI?
I think, I guess it's for now what we have the schedule for SBI. The meetings have been postponed to 2021, but there's a virtual reading in November. So what is proposed for the time being is that The draft outline would be revised based on the inputs that we receive in this current consultation, and that would be discussed at SBI 3. So there will be further opportunity, at least after SBI 3, to input on the development of the plan. So this is still very much the initial outline of the plan that we're working on at the moment.
Great, thanks, Tanya. And then one last question for John, and it's yeah, in terms of Indigenous people and traditional knowledge, is capacity of Indigenous people, organizations, and communities. Sorry, let me start over. So it's a question as to what the greatest challenge is for Indigenous peoples and local communities, and the question is the challenge largely related to capacity amongst Indigenous peoples and local communities, or the willingness of governments, I guess, to involve Indigenous peoples and local communities? So it's a question as to where you think the greater challenge lies.
Good question. I think the challenge is engaging with governments, Indigenous peoples and local communities, for instance, have their own initiatives of community-based monitoring and information systems, and also developing their own indicators for well-being that are tied closely to biodiversity. So I think the real issue is, for me, it's a great missed opportunity that governments are not reporting and are not embracing, supporting, and reporting on the collective and local actions of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And it remains one of the reasons why we're not going to achieve the strategic plan. It's something that we need to address in the negotiations for the Global Biodiversity Framework, because high-level policies will have their place, but action is done at the local level. And that's why we need to have very strong bridges built between Indigenous peoples, local communities at the local level, and governments. Thank you for that question.
Great, thanks, John. So I think we're pretty much out of time. So at this point, I'm just going to hand the floor over to Jyoti, who's the secretary for SBI 3, for some closing remarks. Thank you. So Jyoti, the mic or the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Kieran, and thanks a lot, Kieran, Tanya, and John, for your amazing presentations. I know it's taken a long time to do this analysis, and not only the documents, but also this presentation. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending this webinar. As you know, this is an extremely important agenda item. We will be building the post-2020 on the experiences of this, of our implementation of the strategic plan 2011-2020 and the IT targets. And as some of you have said, why, you know, some of the, we have to do an in-depth analysis and a deep thinking on why we haven't met some of the IT targets, or a lot of the IT targets. And we should consider these before or while we are developing post-2020. This agenda item also links very closely with the with agenda item 11 on review mechanisms, and so we have to keep both of them under consideration when we discuss this at SBI. I will not say a lot more because I know we are over time, and hand it over back to the SBI chair to give her final remarks. Thank you. And I apologize for not being there in the at the opening. I had some technical issues. It's raining here in New Delhi, and sometimes the electricity and internet acts up then. So thanks a lot, and I will hand back to Charlotta for her final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. And I would also like to thank you all for attending this webinar. I think it's been very useful. And a special thanks to the Secretariat, who has prepared all presentations and also prepared all technical things around this session. Thank you very much for all your work. And as been said, I mean, this is a very important agenda item, a basis for the common discussions on a post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So I do really hope that you all now have a better understanding of this agenda item and its related documents. And with that, since we're already over time, I think I would like to close this session. And I wish you all a nice weekend. Goodbye. And thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.